The Commando units of the Republic Army were very, very special units, but just how capable and how talented were they? Let's dive in. Hey YouTube, welcome to the Force Feed. I'm John, and if my voice sounds a little bad, it's because I'm getting over a cold, so I apologize, but we'll get through this video just fine. Today we're reviewing a book called Star Wars Republic Commando Hard Contact. This book takes place in 22 BBY. It was written by Katarn Travis, and it was released in 2004. I've been waiting to read a book like this that doesn't lean heavily on Jedi and Sith, and just looking at in-depth looks at the clone troopers and their squads, and the camaraderie between them, and just exactly how talented they are. We do see bits and pieces of it in the Clone Wars. We see it in the prequel trilogy. Nothing really in depth, and this really shows you just their militaristic capabilities, and it was interesting to read because of that. But before we get more into it, I just want to remind everybody that if you wanted to read this book before you watch this review, there will be a link in the description for this book, as well as the next 3 books that I'll be reading on this channel. Just keep in mind that I am an Amazon affiliate, and those are Amazon links, so if you use those links to purchase the books, they will benefit me or the channel in some way. Please don't do it to benefit me. I appreciate it if you do. Do it so we can continue the conversation. You love talking about it. Also, if you do like the content that you see today, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I've never read a Katarn Travis book. This is my first one. This is my first time getting into the Republic Commando series. I know there's a few books in the Republic Commando series. I think it's 4 or 5, something like that. So I'm interested to get into all of them. I do read these books chronologically, and there are some books that take place in between the Republic Commando series. We'll kind of skip back and forth between them. This book revolves around a squad of commandos, and they all come from different units, but a couple of them at least, all of the people in their former units passed in other battles. So they come into the Omega squad dealing with the loss of these other brothers. I don't know if it was all of them. I can't remember if it was all of them that dealt with that, but at least a couple of them did. So they are responsible for going to a planet called Skirata. On this planet, there is a virus being developed called the nanovirus, and it's being funded by the Separatists. It's being overseen by a Mandalorian warrior named Gez Hokan, and there's a scientist that's overseeing the project, the creation of the project, and her name was Ovalat Quail Uthan. I believe that's how you pronounce it. So they basically land on the planet to search for this nanovirus and try to eradicate it and shut down the Separatist project or operation that's developing this virus. In short, they go through a series of battles between different members of Hokan's group, eventually are able to find the location of where the virus is being created, and they end up getting into a fight with Gez Hokan. Spoiler alert, Gez Hokan loses and is ceremoniously decapitated by a lightsaber, much like Jango Fett was in episode 2, which they do outline the symbolism of that kill based on just how the death of Jango Fett traveled throughout the Mandalorian Brotherhood, if you will. Pretty easy to be concise about this. There's a series of things that happen in the book. They run into some interesting characters. There's Weequay in the book, which is the same species as Hondo. You'll remember Hondo from the Clone Wars series, also in Rebels. And they just basically go back and forth, and you kind of learn exactly like all of their terminology, how they work together, how harshly the training was ingrained into them. And you also learn a lot of harsh realities about what the clone troopers went through when they were being trained on Kamino, and we'll get more into that. But now we're going to get into the did it appear anywhere else segment of the video. The first term I heard in the book that I was curious about was called simunition, and it's basically like fake ammunition if you think of like blank rounds for military personnel. Instead, it's like digital ammunition for clone troopers before they go to live rounds in a real combat situation. I'd never heard of that term before, and I was wondering if it appeared anywhere else in any other book, and it does not. This is the only book that that term appears in. It's not super significant, but it was an interesting term to hear. Gez Hokan, the Mandalorian that oversees the operation of the nanovirus being created, I wanted to know if he was in any other book, and generally when you hear about Mandalorians, they all have their own kind of legendary aura to them of things they've accomplished. You know, you don't really hear about any weak ones. There are ones that are weaker than others, but for the most part, they're all pretty badass. They all do awesome things. So I was wondering if he was mentioned anywhere else, and this is the first book that he takes place in, and obviously he, like I mentioned before, he dies in the book. I already warned you guys about the spoilers, but he is also mentioned in all of the other Republic Commando books, which includes Republic Commando 000, Republic Commando True Colors, Order 66, a Republic Commando novel, and Imperial Commando 501st. He's only mentioned in those books. He doesn't appear in any other book because he dies in this book. And the third and last thing that I was wondering about was the species, the Gurlanin, which are native to the planet Skirata, which is the planet that the clone troopers went to shut down the nanovirus operation. And the person in this book who is a Gurlanin species is named Jinart, and they're shapeshifters. And that was interesting to me because we know about the shapeshifter that takes place in episode 2. That shapeshifter's name was Zam Wessel, and that species was a Claudite, and they were from the planet Zolan. So this is a completely different shapeshifter from Skirata, and the species name is Gurlanin. That species is also mentioned in those other 4 books that I mentioned before when I'm talking about Gez Hokan. Not mentioned in any other book, first mentioned in this book. So now we can move on to the things that I found interesting in this book. Katarn Armor is the special armor that clone commandos would sometimes wear during combat situations in the Clone Wars. I've never heard of this armor on any other clone trooper in the movies and other books. I didn't know if it was unique to certain troopers, to this book, or anything like that, or how special it actually was, but the way that they talked about it in the book, it was pretty impressive armor to wear, and it protected you from a multitude of things. I found it interesting because of the name. The one thing that came to mind was Kyle Katarn from the Jedi Knight series, if anybody's familiar with that game series. I didn't know if it was a callback to that Jedi, or if it was just another name for armor that they came up with, and it just happened to be a coincidence. But the only other place that this armor is mentioned in is the game Star Wars Galaxies in the second expansion called Rage of the Wookiees. I never actually played Star Wars Galaxies, forgive me. I didn't know if that armor is purchasable in that game or where it actually appears, but they mentioned it in this book, and I just like the name. Some of you may already know this, but the Mandalorians have their own language, and I don't remember hearing it being spoken. Maybe I just missed it or just don't remember. It reminded me kind of like Latin. There's a song that one of the clone troopers sings in this book that's like old Mandalorian folk song, and the note that I left had to do with one of the clone troopers' names, which was Atten, and apparently that's Mandalorian for stubborn. So the clone troopers have definitely taken on a lot of Mandalorian values that came from Jango Fett, which makes sense. It's the only thing that they really identify with, besides the fact that they're there for the Republic fighting a war and bred to die, basically. So you have their own language. While Jango Fett was on Kamino, he actually trained with some of the clone units on the planet, and he took on a unit called Kaivul Dar, which is a Mandalorian term that stands for those who no longer exist. And I believe it's kind of like a special secret ops type unit that he was training, like a CIA type unit where they lose all contact with anybody else. No one knows they exist, basically. They're just a very specialized unit. First, I thought, wait, Jango Fett doesn't fight on the side of the clone troopers, and why would he do this? But he doesn't know that until he leaves Kamino. When I think about it out loud now, it doesn't make much sense. He was used as the clone base to create the clone troopers, but then he sides with the Separatists with Count Dooku on the opposite side of the clones. None of this makes any sense. Clones training on Kamino contain such harsh programming. When I say programming, I mean that they were much like Marines, just beaten down to where they're nothing, which they have no base to really beat down on because they don't know anything else. This is all they know, right? Every single thing that you would need to know in a military situation, whether it's how to fire certain guns or what to do in a combat situation in like a high stress situation, or being a medic or communication or anything, they basically know everything that you're supposed to know out in the field, even things that certain specialized units would need to know. I believe there were specialized people that knew certain things more than others, but they all had at least basic to medium knowledge of almost everything. And it's impressive, but also sad when you listen to them talk about just what they know and how hard it was ingrained into them, and just the harsh reality of their training on Kamino. Banking off that last point, it was mentioned that clones on Kamino, if they contained any sort of handicap or deficiency, they were basically killed off by the Kaminoans, or at least by whoever was overseeing the training. I'm sure there were other personnel that was overseeing that training to make sure that only the best caliber clones would come out of it and fight for the Republic. They left room for very little error. If you made any errors or you were deficient in any particular way that they found to be faulty, then you were killed off. That's just sad. When Jango Fett was killed by Mace Windu in the Battle of Geonosis, that news spread very, very quickly because this book takes place in the same year that the Battle of Geonosis took place in, and Gez Hokan mentions the death of Jango Fett and talks about basically how sad of an event it was, the demise that he came to Mace Windu. And he even had a chance to decapitate someone else because of someone that wronged him or that didn't do his bidding well enough, something like that. He had the lightsaber of a master that he killed on the planet, a Jedi master, and he was going to decapitate him, but he decided not to because of the way that Jango Fett was killed, and he didn't want to mimic that. So very strong feelings about that, and just amazing how quickly that news spread. When the clones need to transport any kind of goods, armor, rations, weapons, anything, it's always called a kit. So anything that they need to collect before they leave, did you grab enough kit? It could be anything. It's basically, do you have every single thing you need? There was a lot of things that they talked about in this book that they created shorthand for, just to create the most efficient communication they possibly could. So when you talk to another trooper and you say, do you have all your kit? That's what they're talking about. Basically anything you would need in a combat situation. There was a clone commando teacher that was named Sergeant Skirata that existed on Kamino and trained a lot of different clones, and he was very revered for his training, but also for his attitude towards the war and towards what the clones were getting themselves into after they left Kamino. And he had very strong feelings about it because he wanted them to understand just how expendable they were, but he also felt sorry for them in that sense. So it was like he was ingraining their purpose to them, that they're basically bred to die, and this is all you're meant to do. You need to embrace it. But he didn't seem happy about it the way that they described it. But they all had a lot of respect for the guy, so it was interesting to hear about him. There were a lot of Jedi that took control of units during the Clone Wars that were commanders, captains. Most of them were commanders or generals because the clones would be captains and sergeants and stuff like that. I don't know the hierarchy of the ranks by memory, but there were a ton of units with Jedis as a leader. It's really interesting how more Jedi didn't turn to the dark side, because just the way the whole thing is structured, where Jedi control these units and they're supposed to obey the Jedi at all times, and they are supposed to kill on command and do anything that the Jedi ask them to do. So the Jedi have this control where the Jedi don't seek control. They seek to make make peace. So they're given control to kill other beings and other things. It's almost completely against what the Jedi stand for. It was kind of like a hazard of the moment, and they all did what they needed to do to win this war. But I don't understand how more Jedi didn't let that go to their head and then turn to the dark side. It's just crazy. Different clones age at different rates, and we know from episode 2 that their aging is supposed to be halved. So if you're 10 years old, you're 20 years old in biological age. That's how your body becomes. But there was a certain passage in the book noted that there was another clone trooper who aged quicker than other clone troopers would have. Clone trooper RC-5093 was retired at CF Vet Center in Coruscant, chronological age 23, biological age 60. 60 is more than double of 23. Presumably he was supposed to be 30 before his biological age became 60. So how much does this vary? Are there some clone troopers that could live much longer than other ones? Do some of them only age 1.5 times or 1.25 times than other ones? It makes sense. Different human beings age at different rates, but I guess it's just something I never thought about based on how their aging was defined in episode 2. The squad that these main 4 clone troopers in the book are a part of is called the Omega Squad. This book was written in 2004, but when I heard the name of the squad, it made me think of like a foreshadowing for Omega and the Bad Batch. I'm sure that's not what was meant, but if anyone knows if the person Omega was thought of before Bad Batch came about, then leave it in the comments, because I would like to know if that was anywhere before the Bad Batch came out. I don't remember hearing it. And the last thing I found interesting in this book is that one of the clone troopers named Darman was able to pull one over on Gez Hokan when they were in a fight at the end of the book. It ended with his other squad member, I think it was Niner or Phi, I can't remember. They were faking being injured, and Gez Hokan decided to come over and kill them with a knife, basically. He wanted to kill them in a personal way. Well, Darman came up behind him with the lightsaber that Gez Hokan had and chopped him down, decapitated him, ceremoniously, just like Jango Fett was. However, they mentioned in the book that Gez Hokan's armor was cut through, so that made me think, does Gez Hokan not have Beskar armor, or was Beskar able to be cut through with a Jedi lightsaber in this book? That obviously eliminates it from canon, but I don't know of Mandalorians wearing armor that's not Beskar, so maybe it was described that way in books previous to the new material coming out. I liked the book. It was interesting. I want to get more into books that have this in-depth look into clone squads and just the day-to-day life of clones. When I was reading it though, I know that's something I wanted to read, but then I kind of realized, man, I do kind of want to listen to the dramatics and stuff of the Jedi Order between Jedi, and some Jedi are fighting their urge to go to the dark side and stuff like that. I always find a lot of interest in looking at those mental struggles with the Jedi and the Sith, basically. But I still feel like I want to get into more books where you see just these different in-depth looks into clone troopers. And so I can't wait to get into the other Republic Commando books. So with that being said, I decided to give the book a 7.8. It's enjoyable, it's informative, but it's still relatively insignificant because the events in the book are just a very small battle on what was happening during the Clone Wars, and maybe a small little anecdote of something that could have happened but didn't take place. But still a fun read and an intro to the in-depth looks of clone troopers. I appreciate everybody that stopped by today, and may the Force be with you, and everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you.